Good morning. We're right at time to get started, and I'm sure there'll be more people come in just a second. And I think there'll be another class that'll come in here today, so we may have some people that are in here that normally don't come to this class, but they should be here shortly. We got a lot of people at Lads to Leaders. Obviously, Drew and his family are at Lads to Leaders. So that's why you see me up here. And I feel honored that Drew asked me to come and teach today. And Lord willing, he'll be back next week. And you'll have, I think, 4 more Sundays to be studying in Acts before we'll change quarters. So hopefully, I'll leave, I think, 5 chapters left for Drew to cover in 4 weeks, and we'll get by all of that. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the acts that we're covering. We're in what would have been the third journey of Paul. So Paul is kind of toward the end of his third journey, and that's where we start looking at chapters 21, 22, and 23. And he's beginning to end his journey, and he wants to head back to Jerusalem to kind of make a report of everything and some things going on that he wants to be in Jerusalem. Now let's take a quick look at what he has done in the third journey. He's gone from, in Acts 18, Galatia, Pargia, I never can say that right, Ephesus, Macedonia, Achaia, Macedonia, Philippi, and Troas. Now, during this time, he's had several that accompanied him, and those would be Gaius, or these names are boogers, or Tisticus, and that's through Acts 19:29. That'll give you that information. And then later on, he was with Luke and about 5 others. Timothy was one. And Acts 24 gives you the names of the people that were with him then. Now, as we're looking to him leaving Miletus, we kind of think, well, we don't know exactly who stayed with him on the journey, but we do know for a fact that Luke was with him. So when he left, when you look at chapter 21, you'll know that we know that Luke was with him. Okay? So let's do this. Let's back up. And I know that Drew did chapter 21 last week, but I want to just go through some of the highlights of chapter 21 that kind of leads into the story with chapter 22 and 23. Now, I've taught Acts before. I've taught the life of Paul before. And at this point, they pretty much mesh together. You can't teach Acts without teaching Paul. You can't teach Paul without teaching Acts. Okay? So let's take a look. And this is on your handout, a little review of chapter 21. Paul and his company, Luke, set sail from Miletus to Jerusalem. Now, just a little trivia for you. They went to Kos, and that's the site of where Hippocrates founded his school. They went to Rhodes, and there's a giant statue of the Greek sun god there, just in case you're ever watching Jeopardy. You need this information. They went to Patara, Lycia, and there they changed to a larger ship. Then to Tyre, Syria. Tyre was an important commercial community famous for glassware, dyes, and metalworks. When they were in Tyre, remember, he found a group of disciples, and he stayed with them for 7 days. After 7 days, it was hard for them to leave. They had bonded together, so the disciples traveled with them as they left. Now, what they did when they were there is they warned Paul not to set foot in Jerusalem. The Spirit had told them, Paul does not need to go to Jerusalem. And after 7 days, when they left, they set sail again. They arrived in Ptolemais and spent the day with brethren there. The next day they sailed to Caesarea, where they entered Philip's house. This is the same Philip that taught the eunuch that was an evangelist there. then Abagus the prophet came down and warned Paul again, do not go to Jerusalem. This is going to happen. And a lot of people say, well, Abagus, who is Abagus? Why does he give this information and why is it important? Well, Abagus is the same Agabus that in Acts 11:28 prophesies the great famine. So he had a little bit of authority to know that he was a prophet and he did know what he was saying. Luke and the local residents, all of them, tried to persuade Paul, don't go. And then Acts 21:13, the second part of that, Luke says, I am ready to be bound and even die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord. So we know that Paul at this point, even the Spirit is saying don't go. All of these people are saying don't go. But Paul has bought in. And our question to us is, are we bought in? Are we bought in as well as Paul was? Are we willing to give up? Not just our life, but things for the service of the Lord. They stayed with a disciple, I don't know how to say that, Mnason from Cyprus. Now, it says he's from Cyprus, but most likely this guy had a home in Jerusalem because they would have had to backtrack to go back to Cyprus to stay with him. All right, they visited with James and the elders. They rejoiced over the progress of reaching the laws to the Gentiles. And then the rumors. Remember, Drew talked about the rumors and the accusation that people said, Paul is forsaking Moses' law on this circumcision issue. And the elders have a plan. Paul, why don't you go and take these people and you cleanse yourself? So what were the elders doing? They were just trying to make peace with everybody, wasn't they? Is that we could take hours and talk about whether elders should just make people happy or do what's right. Whether you say they were wrong or they were right in this is just giving us the facts. This is what happened. This is what they suggested to Paul he do. Paul did it, didn't he? So on the seventh day of the cleansing, that it was over, these people from Asia, these Jews from Asia come down. Now, specifically it said these Jews from Asia came down. It wasn't the local people. How many times do we have uproars in this country? And they determined that the people that were really causing all the uproars were what? People that came from other places and caused the uproar. So these people came from the other places and got everything stirred up again. Just when they were about to kill Paul, the commander of the Roman cohort steps in, bound Paul, and carried him away. He didn't know Paul. He didn't know about Paul. He just knew that all of these people were attacking Paul. So Paul must be a bad dude. He must be trouble. So they came in and they swept him up to keep these people from killing him. And he asked Paul, the commander asked Paul, do you speak Greek? Paul said, yes, I do. So we know that Paul spoke many languages, right? So yes, he spoke Greek. And the guy asked him, where'd he go? Oh, the commander asked Paul, are you the Egyptian that stirred up a revolt? The Egyptian that stirred up the revolt that was never captured. There was a revolt during this time, before this time, to where this guy comes in and he has about 30,000 soldiers with him, this Egyptian, and he's going to come in and he's going to take over Jerusalem and wipe out the Romans in Jerusalem. Well, obviously it didn't develop, and they would run off, and this Egyptian guy was never captured. So that's why this commander says, are you this Egyptian that was trying to stir things up before with these people? Obviously he wasn't. No, he wasn't. But Paul asked the commander. Well, this is what Paul told the commander. Listen to this. In Greek, this is what he told him. I'm a Jew from Tarsus, a Roman citizen, a citizen of no insignificant city. What does that mean, no insignificant city? Everything I've read about this, there's two. One is there was a guy that was a playwright during this time, and he said that he used the word insignificant city to refer to Athens. And another thing is that Tarsus was under Roman rule, but the Romans let Tarsus kind of run as an independent city. So they were under Roman rule, but it was kind of like an independent city. They could use their own money and all of this. So this is how Paul described it. I am of no insignificant city. And then Paul asked to speak to the crowd. After he was given permission, Paul hushed the crowd in his Hebrew dialect. Okay? So that tells us Paul speaks Greek and he speaks Hebrew. And he can talk to the people. And then we start with chapter 2, and that's kind of where we are to begin today. We're hopefully to get through chapter 2 and chapter 3. So let's read together Acts 22, verses 1 through 4. Brethren and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew dialect, they began even more quiet, and he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus, of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting both men and women in prison. So now Paul has their attention. Okay? So he's addressing them. What's the first thing he tells them? He's a Jew, right? Pretty simple. You could read that on your form. Okay? A lot of the questions are written down, so if I ask them, you can just read out the answer. Okay? So he's a Jew. So are these Jews that are accusing him? So he's telling me, I am also a Jew. What's the second thing he tells them? He was born in Tarsus, Cilicia. Okay? He was educated in Jerusalem. Paul's father was a Pharisee. Okay? The big Pharisee school was in Jerusalem. So at some point in Paul's life, I joke around and say he went to a Pharisee boarding school. But at some point, he left Tarsus and went to Jerusalem and started training to be a Pharisee. And it wasn't just a little bit of training. I mean, they were very detailed in their training to be a Pharisee. So it was a big deal to be a Pharisee. So he was educated in Jerusalem. And here's the next one. Who is he taught by? Who taught? Who was the teacher of Paul? Yeah, say it again. Yeah, Gamaliel. I was wondering how to say it. That's why I got you to say it. Say I tricked you. Okay? So he was one of the most renowned teachers of Pharisees. And Paul sat at his feet and was taught by him. You know, that's to say that we sat at one of the feet of one of the most prestigious schools and learned. Okay? So Paul was taught by the best, at the best. What was he taught? The Jewish law, yeah. He was taught the Jewish law. So what was different about him and the people that he was addressing? That's the whole point that he was trying to make. I'm just like you. I am just exactly like you. So he was zealous for God. Do you think they were considering them zealous for God? Because they were trying to get rid of Paul. Do you think they were thinking of persecuting the Christian the way? Yeah. So Paul tells them, I did the same thing you're doing now. I was there. I understand what you're thinking. So he's addressing this crowd that just tried to kill him. So let's read on. We're going to read verses 5 through 21 now. As also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify from them, I also received the letters to the brethren and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. But it happened that as I was on my way approaching Damascus about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus, the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. And these who were with me saw the light, to be sure, but did not speak the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I want you to hold your finger in verse 9. We're going to come back to it in just a second. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said, Get up and go into Damascus, and they'll be told that you may, and you will be told of what that has been appointed for you to do. But since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. A certain Ananias, a man who was devoted by the standard of the law and well spoken by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, standing near, said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very time I looked up at him. And he said, The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear an utterance from his mouth. For you will a witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you delay? Get up and be baptized, wash away your sins, calling on his name. And it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by approval, watching out for the coats and for those who were slaying him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. They listened to him up to his statement. They listened to him up to this statement. Let's stop there for a minute. So if we look back in the account in chapter 9, okay, you got chapter 9, the conversion of Paul. You got chapter 22, the conversion of Paul. What's different about those two? What's the difference? The hearing the voices, because I kind of gave you that as a hint, didn't I? Chapter 9. Somebody look over in chapter 9. I think I've got it written on there. The verse, chapter 9:7. Read that out loud for me, Adam.
And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one. Then Saul arose from the ground, and his eyes were opened, he saw no one, but the led by the hand he brought him into Damascus.
Okay, in verse 22, verse 9, it says, And those who were with me saw the light, to be sure, but they did not understand the voice of the one. So the world will tell you, if you look up these two verses, they're going to tell you that there are, what? Doesn't match. They'll say that doesn't match. There's a contradiction. There's a contradiction in God's Word. If you looked up all the contradictions that people think they would find, this would be one of them. Do you find a contradiction there? This is pretty easy to defend. Yeah, they heard it. They heard what was being said. Did they understand? We don't know. But they heard it, right? Y'all see what I'm saying here? Is the world is going to tell you there's a contradiction. But you need to know that there is no contradiction there. What else in this verse that's different, or this conversion of Paul that's different in chapter 9 versus chapter 21? Uh-huh. Yeah, the one that heard it knew what he was talking about. Right. Yeah. Well, it's not like he didn't believe in the Lord. Yeah. If you look at, Luke is writing the entire chapter, right? But during this chapter, Luke is writing in chapter 9, he's writing the story himself. Okay? This happened. But in chapter 21, if you read it, Luke is recording what Paul said. Right? Paul said this. We can put it all in quotation marks. I thought that was interesting. And I'd never really thought about that before. Even though Luke is writing it, he's telling the story here, and then he's recording exactly what what Paul said over here. Y'all think that's interesting? Maybe I'm just different. I don't know. All right, let's look at verses 22. We'll go all the way through 30. They listened to him up to this statement, and they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he shall not be allowed to live." As they were crying out and throwing off their clothes and tossing dust in the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that they might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion, who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman." The commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money." And Paul said, "But I was actually born a citizen." So those born in Tarsus were considered citizens. There was Roman rule. Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him, and the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set them before him. So Paul is telling them his story of what happened. They became outraged. They couldn't handle it anymore. So they start taking their coats off, throwing them in the air. They pick up dirt and they throw the dirt. Does that seem normal? Look in 2 Samuel. Chapter 16. Yes?
Back up there to that chapter 22, verse 9. If you substituted the word understood not.
Yeah, and there's not. If you just read it, you would see that there's not. You know, and I just thought it was funny that the world would call that a contradiction. That's why I even brought it up. That's all they got to go on. All right, 2 Samuel 16, verse 13. So David and his men went on the way, and Shemaiah went along on the hillside parallel with him, and as he went, he cursed and cast stones and threw dust at him. So that was a way for them to show their what? Their displeasure and their anger. Okay, we know they tear the clothes, we know that they throw the dust, so that's just a Jewish way to throw dust. And I'm sure they were throwing the dust, not just in the air, but at Paul. Okay, these guys were upset. They were mad. So the chief captain, Lysias, intervened because of the commotion, and he sent the guards to get Paul. And what did they do to Paul? Where did they take him? They took him to the barracks, right? Not to jail. They don't know who he is yet. They don't know what's going on. So let's just swoop this guy up before he gets killed and take him on. Even though the commander has already been told that he's a Jew, that he's a Roman citizen, right? So they sweep him up and take him to the barracks. Here, when they take him to the barracks, it was customary for the Romans to get the information out of somebody by how? Yeah, I'm going to beat you till you tell me the truth. My mom used to do that. I'm going to beat you till you tell me the truth. Sometimes I told her the truth even if it wasn't the truth. So the whipping would stop. I thought I'd get more of a snigger out of that, but it's okay. But they took him and they bind him in chains. This is Paul, okay? They bind him in chains and they say, we're fixing to find out why these people are so mad at you. And then what does Paul do? Yeah. What verse is that? 25. Let's read 25 again. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is Roman and uncondemned? That changed everything. For the rest of the time, you see Paul in his journeys and everything that happens to him is different than if he was just a Jewish citizen. A lot of bad things happen to him, but the Romans can't touch him because he has not broken any laws. The Jews are mad at him, but really he hadn't broken any of their laws either. He's just making them mad. So it's interesting to me that if you go back and read, what did the Lord tell him on the road? I'm going to send you and I'm going to let you know what I have in store for you. You think he knows he's a Roman citizen? Yeah. Think he knows he's a Jew? Yeah.
Did they have a lot of Jews that were Roman citizens?
Only those that were born in Roman territories like, yeah.
Already knew that they worshiped only God, but yet they had laws where Caesar was their number one man. But yet they still love to be citizens.
Yeah. Yeah, and everything I've read before, they'll say, well, maybe they regretted it later because some of the Jews used their Roman citizenship against them. But the whole point is the Romans, if they made a territory Roman rule, then they could collect taxes. It was all about the money. It's kind of like if you go down 25 through Flowood, you'll find out that most of those areas on either side of 49 are incorporated into the city of Flowood, so they could get taxes from all of those places. So here is Paul telling them, I'm a Roman citizen. So look at, I don't know if I have it on there, Roman citizen, They immediately unbound Paul. Immediately. It was against the law. Now, they couldn't be killed for beating Paul, but they could be punished for beating Paul. So the Roman commander was still unsure. Why are these people mad? It's got to have something to do with the Jewish law, because he's not done anything that they know of. So he says, well, let's do this. Let me get the council assembled again. And he took Paul. He said, we're going to find out what's going on here. Let's find out. We got this Roman citizen that's a Jew. He hadn't broken any laws with us. So it's got to be some religious law that he's breaking. And we really have no control over that. So let's gather everybody together and let's find out what's going on. So he gathered them back together. And that's where we pick up in chapter 23. So let's read 23, 1 through 5. Paul looked intently at the council and said, Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? But the bystander said, Do you revile God's high priest? Verse 5, and Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, so when it says the council, when it says the council here, what council are they talking about here? The Sanhedrin council. Okay? And just a little bit of an insight before we get to it. The Sanhedrin council is made up of 72 men. Jerusalem is the main Sanhedrin council. 72 men, Sadducees and Pharisees. Okay? So that's who makes up the Sanhedrin council. Also, they have a high priest. And in the Pharisee sect of the Sanhedrin council, a lot of scribes. And if scribes go back a long way, right? There are a lot of scribes within the Pharisees that are Pharisees. Okay, and that's a whole different lesson to learn about how the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes play in to the work of the Old and New Testament. Or the Old, and some of them just in the New. So anyway, how did Paul start out? I am just like you. Again, doesn't he? He tells the Sanhedrin council, I am just like you. This is not the mob that was from Asia. Okay? These are people from within the region that should know better. Okay? Because they're the Sanhedrin council. They're better than anybody else. Ananias says, as soon as he says that, I'm a faithful person just like y'all. And Ananias says, slap him in the mouth. And what do? They slap him in the mouth. So Paul calls him a whitewashed wall. Is that what it says? You know what that means? You hypocrite. You are judging me, have me struck. I have not been judged. You'll find that in Deuteronomy. I think the verse is down there somewhere and all of that. Deuteronomy 25, 1 and 2. You'll find out in the Jewish law, you had to go to a judge, and if a judge says you're guilty, then they can strike you. But at this point, Ananias has him struck unjustly, and Paul says, you hypocrite, you're judging me on what you think is the law, and you're breaking it yourself. But then somebody says, hey, Paul, that's the high priest. You know we're not supposed to talk bad about the high priest or say anything ugly to the high priest. But then Paul apologized. Why do you think Paul apologized at this point? Yeah. It's kind of one of the same reasons we drive 40 miles an hour on Sidewell Road, right? We do that because that's the law. And that's the law we follow. So he knew that's the law they followed. So he's not going to break that law. So he's going to apologize. I'm going to make amends for calling you a hypocrite. Okay? Now, what he's not saying is I'm better than you, although wouldn't have been bad for him to say there. Okay? Verses 6 through 10. Well, and that's true, but when you think about it, the law of Christ had been changed, but some of the laws they had on the books were just everyday laws, right? I mean, it wouldn't be lawful for us to go and slap somebody. You know, it would be good. A good Christian law wouldn't accept it, but, you know, you're right, they didn't accept the new law. But there were some things that I think they followed just because it was good, maybe good practice. I don't know. That's me. So let's look at verses 6 through 10. But perceiving that the one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." That's really all he needed to say there to cause an uproar. And look what happens when he says that. There occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection or an angel or a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there occurred a great uproar. Some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." And a great dissension was developing. The commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him to the barracks. Not to jail, to the barracks. Okay? So here again, Paul realizing when he said it, resurrection of the dead, Pharisees, Sadducees, they get after it with each other. And he's the one they're all mad at. But they're getting it with each other. It causes a great big uproar. The commander again fears for Paul's life, so he goes and swoops him up and takes him to the barracks, takes care of him. Look at verse 11. Verse 11, we'll do it just standalone. Verse 11, on the night, immediately the Lord stood at his side and said, "Take courage. As for you, I have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness in Rome also." Where's one of the main places Paul wanted to go to preach? Rome. Look in Romans. Well, I don't know that we have time to read all of it, but if you look in Romans chapter 1, verses 10 through 17, Paul is writing to the Romans and he's telling to them, I said, look, I really want to come and preach in Rome. I'm in Rome. I really want to spend some time with you, brother, in Rome. I really want to be there, but at a certain point, it just looked like he would never make it. But God stands up with him this night and says, we've seen all the work that you've done in Jerusalem. You're going to go to Rome and you're going to be able to teach in Rome. What did that do for Paul? That sealed the deal. He knows now they can't touch him. He can teach with boldness even more because they can't touch him. He's going to make it to Rome. His life is going to be spared till he teaches in Rome. Right? By the way, just a side note, I had this written down. Paul was somewhere around 53 at this point. Give or take 1 or 2 years on either end, but he was around 53 during this time. So let's read on so we can get finished. 12 through 25. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under the oath, saying that we would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. Excuse me. They came to the chief priest and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore, you and the council notify the commander, bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation, and we for our part will be ready to slay him before he comes near the place." So he got these 40 guys that are going to take an oath. We're not going to eat or drink. I'm going to tell you, these guys starved to death because they didn't get to kill Paul. Paul's nephew, which we know Paul has a sister now, right? Gives us a little more insight about Paul. He has a sister, and his sister's son overheard the plot and goes and tells Paul, "There's a plot to kill you." He goes to the barracks to him. He goes to the barracks. If he were in jail, would he have access to him? Probably not. But he can go to the barracks and tell Paul, we'll read on. But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to him," and said, "Lead the centurions to him and said, 'Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him.' So they took him and led him to the commander and said, 'Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you.' The commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, 'What is it that you have to report to me?' And he said, 'The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council, as though we were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him to have bound him. They have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink till they slay him, and now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you.' So the commander led the young man go, instructing him, 'Tell no one that you have notified me of these things.'" So Paul's nephew tells the commander. The commander's got the information. "Go and tell them, don't tell anybody that you told me this, and we'll take care of things." So what did they do? Verses 23 through 25 to really 24 tells us what he gathered together. "This is how we're going to protect you, Paul." The commander said 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen take Paul to Caesarea during the night, which was about 60 miles. Is that kind of an overkill? That's a lot of people guarding Paul, right? Against 40. So we're going to do a show of force. We're going to do it during the night, but if anybody sees this, they're not going to stop. Do you think they knew Paul was special? I can't say that for a fact, but they knew that Paul needed to make it to Caesarea, to the governor, because the commander didn't want it on his head. So here, let's read now, and I'm trying to skip along to make sure we finish this. The commander, in verses 25, wrote this letter to the governor. "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman, and wanted to ascertain the charge for which they are accusing him. I brought him down to their council, and I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a great plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you." All right, there's a letter he wrote. What's interesting about the letter he wrote? Here's what he did. Paul was seized by the Jews on the verge of being killed. I rescued Paul in the nick of time. I discovered he was a Roman citizen. I brought Paul before the council because of religious issues. I found no cause for his death or imprisonment. I discovered a plot to kill him. What did he leave out? Read it in the next line. What he forgot to tell them? Oh, by the way, I put this guy in chains and was fixing to beat the fire out of him. But he didn't tell Felix that. Why didn't he? He'd have gotten in trouble, right? So he made himself, I did this, I did this, I did this. and sent a group, all these horsemen and spearmen, sent them with Paul. They delivered Paul to the governor, and we'll finish reading 31. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go back with him, they returned to the barracks. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and then they learned that he was from Cilicia. He said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers have arrived also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So they delivered him, and the governor said, I'll just hold on to you till they get here and we know what charges they have against you. So you'll start reading in the next chapter, and this is what y'all will look at next week, is it was 5 days before the lawyer and they went to say what charges they had against. What is Herod's praetorium? What is that? Where did they take him? Where did they not take him? To jail. Yeah. So they kept him there. So if you kind of watch from here on with Paul, you're going to discover that, he's been in jail before, but now that the Romans have him, they can't put him in jail. They can't bind him. They don't have anything against him. So, any questions or comments? All righty. That's it. Thank y'all. My shoe was untied this whole time, and I was afraid I was going to trip, so